It started without warning. Early this morning, multiple sources inside Russia reported what officials are calling a major technical incident at one of the country's largest oil refineries near Moscow. But according to information obtained from independent monitoring networks and satellite imagery, the word technical no longer fits. The refinery, responsible for nearly a fifth of the capital region's fuel supply, was hit by what appears to be a coordinated drone strike. Within minutes, flames rose hundreds of meters into the air. The blast could be heard across several districts. Emergency services rushed to the scene, yet the scale of the damage suggests something far more serious than a local malfunction. For the first time in years, Moscow's energy heart stopped beating. Official statements appeared almost immediately. State media described the event as a short-term disruption, assuring that production would resume within hours. But eyewitnesses tell a different story. Video footage shared on encrypted channels shows long columns of smoke, emergency helicopters circling overhead, and military vehicles blocking nearby roads. Several independent analysts confirmed that the facility's main distillation unit is completely offline, with secondary storage tanks burning out of control. Fire brigades have been ordered to prevent explosions in adjacent chemical zones. The images evoke scenes not seen in Russia since the 1990s. By late morning, the Ministry of Energy released a brief update: no casualties, no impact on exports, full control of the situation. Yet data from regional supply systems contradicts that claim. Gasoline shipments to Moscow's southern districts have been suspended, and at least 2 smaller refineries have switched to emergency mode to compensate for the loss. Industry insiders quietly admit that restoring the damaged unit could take weeks. This isn't just an accident, one of them said. It's paralysis. Meanwhile, panic began spreading through the financial sector. Futures on Russian fuel fell sharply within minutes of the first reports. Investors demanded explanations that the Kremlin wasn't ready to provide. For the moment, the official narrative remains unchanged: no sabotage, no foreign involvement, no reason for alarm. But sources within the security establishment are less certain. Several have confirmed that the pattern of damage resembles previous drone strikes on energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory. And while the government avoids naming any suspects, the silence itself speaks volumes. International observers are watching closely. In European capitals, energy analysts warn that this single incident could trigger a cascade of instability across the region's fuel markets. Ukraine has not issued any statement, but online networks close to its military structures share the same message: strategic targets matter. Still, no one has claimed responsibility. At this hour, Moscow remains tense. Traffic around the refinery zone is sealed off. Residents report hearing additional explosions throughout the morning, though officials deny it. The authorities continue to insist everything is under control. But the air above the capital is filled with the scent of burning oil, and with a sense that something far greater has just begun. The question now is not what happened, but how deep the chaos will reach. By midday, the situation in Moscow had shifted from confusion to open alarm. The plume of black smoke from the refinery was still visible from the city center, hanging over the skyline like a shadow that refused to fade. Despite repeated assurances from officials that the fire was contained, satellite data and live feeds from nearby highways told another story. The blaze continued to spread, fueled by ruptured storage tanks and secondary explosions. Local residents reported tremors strong enough to rattle windows more than 20 kilometers away. The city's emergency channels, usually calm and bureaucratic, now crackled with static and conflicting orders. Something inside the system had broken, and not just the refinery. By early afternoon, the first sign of real panic appeared. Gas stations across the Moscow region saw sudden surges of customers. Drivers queued for hours, fearing that the attack would lead to shortages or price spikes. At several locations, fuel ran out within minutes. Police were dispatched to maintain order, but tension was visible everywhere. "It feels like the beginning of something bigger," said one witness near Domodedovo. "People don't believe the officials anymore. They believe what they see in the sky." On social media, images of the burning complex went viral, despite heavy censorship. Attempts to block the footage only fueled speculation that the government was hiding the true scale of the damage. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was described by one insider as unusually strained. Closed meetings followed one another with no public statements. According to sources familiar with the matter, security agencies were ordered to investigate possible external interference, including the hypothesis of a coordinated drone operation launched from outside Russian borders. What makes this scenario alarming is not just the precision of the strike, but its timing. The refinery was hit at the exact moment of a scheduled maintenance rotation, when critical safety systems were offline. "It was surgical," said a defense analyst. Whoever planned this knew the schedule better than the people working there. International reactions came fast and cautious. In Brussels, NATO's monitoring unit confirmed unusual aerial activity over western Russia in the hours before the incident. In Washington, officials avoided direct accusations but called the explosion a wake-up call for Russian domestic security. Meanwhile, energy markets began to tremble. European traders, long dependent on Russian oil derivatives, faced sudden uncertainty. The price of diesel surged by 8% in a single session, an echo of the vulnerability that many thought was behind them. Inside Russia, the tone of state media changed subtly but noticeably. Morning optimism gave way to defensive rhetoric. News anchors began speaking of external provocations, cyber interference, and acts aimed at destabilizing the economy. Yet none of them used the word attack officially. The unspoken rule was clear: avoid acknowledging weakness. Still, the public mood grew darker by the hour. Independent observers described an atmosphere of quiet chaos, where everyone sensed danger but no one dared to describe it. As afternoon turned to early evening, power outages began flickering through several districts. Officials blamed high demand on the grid, though insiders said the refinery's shutdown had disrupted local energy loops. That's when reports emerged of an emergency meeting between top military and intelligence officials. The agenda remains classified, but one phrase leaked to journalists: national response readiness. For Moscow, those words mark the moment when a technical accident officially becomes a matter of national security. For Moscow, those words mark the moment when a technical accident officially becomes a matter of national security. And yet, amid all the official denials and tightly controlled broadcasts, one fact stands: Russia's largest refinery is offline, its skyline is burning, and its leadership faces a crisis it cannot easily define. The next move, whether denial, retaliation, or concealment, will decide whether this is a single-day emergency or the start of something far more destabilizing. By early afternoon, the crisis had expanded far beyond Moscow's industrial perimeter. What began as a single explosion at an oil refinery had evolved into a national emergency. The government still refused to use that term, but the signs were unmistakable. Flights were grounded at 3 regional airports due to airspace security concerns. Rail transport for fuel shipments was suspended indefinitely. In several provinces, governors quietly activated contingency plans, measures typically reserved for wartime scenarios. Behind the calm of official press releases, the machinery of state was shifting into a defensive mode. Inside Russia's power structures, the hunt for answers had turned frantic. Security agencies launched parallel investigations, often stepping on each other's jurisdiction. One group focused on possible sabotage from within, another examined the digital infrastructure that controls refinery operations. According to sources familiar with the process, early data indicated that the refinery's control network was compromised minutes before the explosions. The systems froze, the alarms didn't sound, and the fire suppression protocol never engaged, said one engineer who managed to evacuate. That doesn't happen by accident. Meanwhile, information leaks began to surface online, describing patterns of cyber interference traced back to servers outside the country. Analysts noted a striking similarity to attacks previously attributed to state-linked hacking groups operating in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The implication was explosive: what if the refinery had been hit twice, once digitally and once physically? For Russian officials, this was the nightmare scenario, a combined strike undermining both infrastructure and confidence. The Kremlin's response remained cautious but pointed. A spokesman stated that certain foreign actors may have an interest in destabilizing the Russian energy sector. No names were mentioned, but the message was unmistakable. On the streets of Moscow, the chaos was quieter but more visceral. Long queues formed not just at gas stations but also near banks and grocery stores. The fear wasn't just about fuel, it was about what might come next. When people stop trusting stability, they prepare for anything, remarked an economist from a state university who requested anonymity. Rumors of further attacks spread faster than official denials could catch them. Reports of unidentified drones seen in the skies over Bryansk and Tula circulated through encrypted channels. None of these sightings were confirmed, yet they fed a growing sense that the country was under siege. At the same time, foreign governments scrambled to assess the situation. Satellite imagery reviewed by Western intelligence agencies confirmed catastrophic structural damage at the facility. Analysts noted that the precision of the strike suggested external coordination, though they stopped short of assigning blame. In Kiev, officials maintained official silence, but Ukrainian media hinted that strategic deterrence was working as intended. In Washington, a senior defense official described the explosion as evidence that Moscow's own instruments of power are now vulnerabilities. The statement, though brief, resonated through every newsroom in Europe. The markets, already volatile, reacted with panic. Oil prices spiked, then plunged, then rose again, an erratic rhythm reflecting confusion more than economics. Traders admitted privately that no one knew whether to expect escalation or restraint. Insurance firms began quietly freezing coverage for shipments passing through western Russia, fearing further disruptions. For a country whose economic lifeline is built on energy exports, this was not just a blow, it was a message. Yet what frightened Russian analysts most wasn't the damage itself, but the timing. The attack struck on the eve of a major fiscal review, when the government was preparing to unveil new economic forecasts. Now, those numbers are meaningless. The entire energy map has to be redrawn, one financial official admitted off record. If we can't restart production in days, we're facing cascading shortages. Still, as evening approached, the Kremlin maintained its posture of control. State television aired calm music, smiling anchors, and reassurances that the fire is nearly extinguished. But even as they spoke, live data from air quality monitors showed toxic plumes drifting over the southern outskirts of the capital. Citizens were advised to stay indoors. The contradiction between official calm and visible crisis deepened the sense of unreality that had settled over Moscow. And that's when the first whisper began to spread through closed networks, that the refinery wasn't the only target. There had been another explosion, smaller, quieter, somewhere hundreds of kilometers away. No confirmation, no images, just a line of text repeated by too many people to ignore. Whether it was truth or fear no longer mattered. The illusion of security had cracked. And once that happens, the damage goes far beyond the flames. Subscribe to follow the next developments, because the question now is not whether Russia can extinguish the fire, but whether it can contain the panic spreading faster than the smoke. By late afternoon, Russia found itself in a situation no one was prepared to describe publicly. What officials continued to call a localized emergency was, in reality, the most severe disruption of the nation's energy infrastructure in over a decade. The explosion at the Moscow refinery had set off a chain reaction that reached far beyond the capital. Supply networks across western Russia were failing one by one. Oil pipelines feeding smaller refineries were shut down for safety checks, fuel distribution hubs suspended operations, pending verification of system stability. According to internal documents reviewed by independent analysts, at least 35% of regional fuel reserves were no longer accessible. For a country whose political order depends on the uninterrupted flow of oil, this was more than an accident, it was a strategic wound. In Moscow, the government's public tone remained controlled, but inside the ministries the atmosphere was closer to panic. Multiple emergency meetings were held throughout the afternoon. According to a source inside the Ministry of Energy, the latest report to the Kremlin used an uncharacteristically blunt phrase, production blackout. The president's press secretary immediately ordered that wording removed from all official briefings, replacing it with the more neutral, temporary technical suspension. But the internal meaning was clear. The capital's fuel lifeline had been cut, and no one could guarantee when it would be restored. Security agencies were now treating the incident as a coordinated attack. Unverified but persistent leaks from the Federal Security Service suggested that fragments of drone components recovered near the site contained foreign-manufactured parts. Investigators also found evidence of remote interference in the refinery's automation systems, possibly indicating a cyber element synchronized with the physical strike. One intelligence officer described the pattern as too perfect to be random. The idea that the country's most guarded industrial zone could be breached both digitally and physically was almost unthinkable. Someone knew the system inside out, said a defense consultant. They hit the heart, and they hit it with precision. The Kremlin's public reaction was carefully scripted. A late afternoon briefing repeated the same refrain, all essential operations are stable. Sabotage has not been confirmed. Yet the backdrop told a different story. Military convoys were seen moving toward the capital under the pretext of supporting emergency response. Anti-air defense systems were activated across several western regions, and local governments were ordered to impose temporary restrictions on drone usage by civilians. In practice, the measures felt like martial law without the declaration. Internationally, reactions were cautious but uneasy. In Brussels, EU energy officials convened an emergency session to discuss potential market fallout. If Russia's internal infrastructure collapses, it affects everyone, one participant noted. The shockwaves don't stop at borders. In Washington, intelligence briefings described the incident as a turning point in the stability of Russian critical assets. Beijing, notably, remained silent. but energy traders in Singapore and Shanghai reported unusual fluctuations in futures tied to Russian oil exports, a sign that markets in Asia were bracing for long-term disruption. Meanwhile, life inside Moscow was growing increasingly chaotic. Gasoline sales were now being rationed, with priority given to emergency services and public transport. Panic buying spread through supermarkets and pharmacies. In some districts, people waited hours for fuel deliveries that never came. Rumors filled the vacuum left by official silence. Some claimed another refinery had been hit, others whispered of a second wave of drones still approaching. The city's usually dense traffic gave way to eerie emptiness as residents chose to stay home. Streets that had never known quiet now echoed with sirens and the distant hum of helicopters circling above the smoldering horizon. Independent analysts monitoring the situation from abroad warned that Russia's leadership faced a dilemma unlike any before. To admit that the refinery was struck by external forces would expose a vulnerability the Kremlin has spent years denying. To insist it was an accident would mean ignoring the growing body of evidence pointing to something deliberate. Both choices carried risk, political, economic, and psychological. When a system built on control loses control, it doesn't know how to speak, said one European diplomat. And yet, amid the chaos, certain signals suggested the government was already preparing for the next stage. Military units specializing in electronic warfare were reportedly redeployed from border regions closer to Moscow. Air defense radars shifted their calibration to track low-altitude targets. Communications between the Ministry of Defense and regional governors intensified, with one directive labeled simply, Phase 2 Readiness. No one outside the top command knows what Phase 2 entails. But within the intelligence community, the phrase is interpreted as a move from containment to retaliation. As evening descended, the air over the capital shimmered with heat and haze. From certain vantage points, the burning refinery looked like a dying sun, its reflection staining the clouds crimson. People stood on rooftops, watching silently, as if aware they were witnessing the beginning of something history would later name. The government continued to broadcast calm, the officials repeated that everything was under control. But inside Russia's corridors of power, every whisper carried the same unspoken question: if the heart of Moscow can burn this easily, what else can burn next? By the end of the day, the smoke over Moscow had thinned but the anxiety had deepened. The fire at the refinery was finally declared under control, yet no one in the capital believed it. The images from the disaster zone, charred machinery, melted pipelines, blackened fields, circulated online despite heavy censorship. For millions of Russians, the sight felt like an omen. The country's energy capital, long seen as invulnerable, had been struck at its core. And though officials insisted that production would soon resume, the real damage was psychological. Russia's most powerful symbol of industrial strength had become a monument to its own fragility. Inside the Kremlin, the tone was grim. Emergency meetings continued late into the afternoon. By this point, the government had divided its response into three parallel fronts: containment, attribution, and perception. Containment meant mobilizing every available resource to restart production and prevent fuel shortages. Attribution meant identifying whoever, or whatever, was behind the strike without provoking an international confrontation too early. Perception meant maintaining the illusion of control, even as the evidence suggested the opposite. "We can't show fear," said one political advisor in a closed briefing. "But we also can't pretend nothing happened." That balance, between denial and desperation, was becoming harder to sustain. Officially, Moscow blamed no one. Unofficially, the list of suspects grew longer by the hour. Intelligence channels buzzed with theories: a cross-border drone operation launched from occupied territories, a coordinated cyberstrike routed through third-party countries, or even sabotage from within. The fact that the refinery security system had gone offline minutes before the explosion remained the most disturbing detail. It was inside knowledge, one former security official said quietly. Someone understood the architecture. This wasn't luck, it was access. That admission, though never spoken publicly, haunted everyone in the room. Meanwhile, the chaos began to ripple outward. Across the country, regional authorities declared preventive alerts, effectively putting local governments on standby. In St. Petersburg, Ekaterinburg, and Samara, air defense units were placed on heightened readiness. Civil aviation authorities restricted airspace over several industrial zones. Even in distant Siberia, local administrations were ordered to test emergency communication lines. It was as if the entire nation had been reminded of its vulnerability all at once. The illusion of distance from conflict, carefully maintained for years, evaporated overnight. On the streets, the fear was quieter but more pervasive. Moscow residents spoke in whispers, speculating about foreign attacks, secret wars, or even internal power struggles. In supermarkets, shelves of bottled water and fuel canisters emptied first, a collective instinct that something larger might follow. Independent journalists, though constrained, began drawing connections between the refinery strike and earlier incidents that had been dismissed as isolated accidents. Looking back, the pattern was obvious: slow, methodical erosion of critical infrastructure, all hidden behind bureaucratic reassurances. "This is not the first hit," one columnist wrote before his article vanished from the internet. "It's just the first one that couldn't be hidden." Internationally, the shockwaves intensified. In Washington, analysts warned that the event marked a new chapter in the shadow conflict shaping Eastern Europe. In Brussels, officials called emergency consultations, fearing retaliatory cyberattacks that might spread beyond Russia. Global markets remained volatile, oscillating between fear of escalation and relief that no new explosions had followed. The International Energy Agency released a brief statement acknowledging temporary supply disruptions, but declined to speculate on causes. Diplomats, meanwhile, tried to decode Moscow's silence. Was it restraint or paralysis? By evening, a new layer of uncertainty emerged. Multiple air defense alerts were triggered across western Russia. Residents of Bryansk, Kursk, and Voronezh reported hearing distant booms. The Ministry of Defense dismissed the incidents as routine exercises, but insiders confirmed that radar operators had detected unidentified objects over at least 2 regions. Whether drones, debris, or paranoia, no one could tell. The fear had become self-sustaining. Once the idea of vulnerability takes hold in a system built on control, it spreads faster than fire. As night settled over the capital, the glow of the extinguished refinery still stained the horizon. The air was thick with the scent of burned oil and quiet disbelief. On state television, anchors spoke softly of restoration, patriotism, and resilience. But their eyes betrayed exhaustion. In private, analysts whispered what no one dared to say publicly, that the refinery strike was not just an attack, it was a message. A demonstration that even in the heart of Russia, chaos could be delivered with precision. For now, the government clings to its composure. The official story remains that production will resume within days, that no lives were lost, that the situation is stable. Yet under that polished surface, the machinery of the state is shifting into something new, more watchful, more paranoid, more uncertain. What burned today was not only oil, but confidence. And as the capital tries to return to normal, one question lingers in the smoke above Moscow: if this could happen once, what stops it from happening again? The silence that follows offers no reassurance, only the uneasy sense that this was not the end, but the first chapter of a crisis still unfolding.